The neighborhood sold itself on certainty. The entrance sign was always freshly washed, the grass around it cut so evenly it looked combed, and the sidewalks felt less like paths and more like rules poured into concrete. Every home had a matching mailbox, matching porch lights, matching fences, and matching little plaques with house numbers that looked like they'd been chosen by a committee that feared originality. People paid for that kind of order because it promised safety, property value, and predictability. What it also promised quietly was that anyone who didn't match the template would eventually be pressured to. I didn't move there because I worshiped the template. I moved there because the property I bought sat at the edge of it, and unlike the identical lots inside the neighborhood, mine had history pinned to it like a seal. It was one of those rare pieces of land that existed before the development, before the HOA, before the glossy brochures and the smiling photos of families on bikes. My deed wasn't just paperwork. It was a timeline, ink and survey lines proving that my house and the strip of land behind it were never meant to be part of their controlled little world. The first months were quiet in a way that made me believe the separation would be respected. I lived like a normal person, not like someone preparing for war. I maintained my yard, kept my driveway clean, repaired a weathered section of fencing near the back line, and installed a simple camera system because I traveled for work sometimes and I preferred to know what happened when I wasn't home. I didn't attend HOA meetings. I didn't ask permission for anything. I didn't use their pool, their clubhouse, their neatly trimmed walking trails that looped like a leash around the community. I stayed polite, waved when neighbors waved, and kept my life inside my property lines. In a reasonable world, that would have been the end of it, but neighborhoods like that don't run on reason, they run on momentum, and momentum demands expansion. The first sign of trouble came disguised as friendliness, the kind that feels practiced. A letter appeared in my mailbox with the HOA logo at the top, the wording full of cheerful phrasing and soft pressure. It welcomed me to the community, reminded me of shared standards, and then slid into the real purpose. A claim that my property fell under HOA jurisdiction due to updated boundary alignment. It wasn't a direct threat yet. It was a test, a way to see if I'd accept their version of reality without questioning it. They asked for dues. They asked for compliance with exterior paint guidelines. They asked for approval of my fence repair, as if I'd borrowed my own land from them. It would have been easy to shrug it off as an honest mistake if the tone didn't carry that subtle confidence of someone who assumes you'll fold. I didn't fold. I did what people rarely do when confronted by official. Looking paper, I checked it. I pulled out my closing documents, my recorded deed, my survey map, and the title insurance paperwork. The lines were clear. The legal description was clear. My property didn't fall under their covenants. The development's boundary stopped where my land began, and that fact wasn't a rumor. It was recorded with the county. I responded the same way I handle any bureaucratic nonsense, calm, documented, and in writing. I sent copies of the relevant pages, highlighted the boundary description, included the official county record reference, and politely stated that their request was incorrect. I expected that would be enough. I expected someone would read it, realize they'd been misinformed, and back off. Instead, the next letter arrived sharper. The friendliness was gone. This one talked about noncompliance, failure to respond appropriately, and the possibility of legal escalation. It referenced fines that didn't apply to me, deadlines that weren't mine, and authority they didn't have. It included a line about community harmony, that vague phrase people use when they want you to sacrifice your rights for their comfort. That was when I understood something important. This wasn't a paperwork mix-up. This was a boundary grab. The neighborhood had been growing in phases, and the newest phase sat uncomfortably close to my back line. That meant there were plans, and plans in developments always included amenities. A walking path, a buffer zone, maybe a small park, maybe a shortcut road. Somewhere in their planning documents, my strip of land likely appeared as blank space that could be repurposed. And blank space makes committees greedy. It isn't enough for them to have what they already control. They want what looks convenient. If they could fold my property into their authority, they could control it, profit from it, or force me into paying dues like everyone else. The pressure started to show up in person. I noticed unfamiliar vehicles idling near the entrance to my driveway. I noticed neighbors who used to wave suddenly watching from behind blinds. I noticed people walking their dogs slower near my fence line, lingering like they were trying to see something or hear something. Once I found a small orange marker flag stuck in the ground, a few feet inside my property line, as if someone had already begun rewriting the boundary with tiny plastic symbols. Another time I found chalk marks on the edge of my driveway, faint but deliberate, the kind used by contractors or survey crews. I removed the marker flag and wiped away the chalk. I took photos. I saved the dates. I reviewed my camera footage and saw what I needed to see. People stepping onto my land briefly, looking around, placing the flag, then walking off like it was normal. They weren't vandals. They moved like they believed they had permission. That was the moment I upgraded my cameras, not because I was scared, but because I could feel the story being written about me in someone else's meeting room. In HOA conflicts, reality often loses to presentation. Whoever controls the narrative controls the neighborhood, and the board always tries to paint the homeowner as the problem. They would claim I was hostile, uncooperative, unreasonable, resistant to community standards. They would use that language to justify escalation. So I prepared like someone who understood the game. I installed additional cameras with wider angles, including one that captured my front boundary clearly. I added a doorbell camera and a high-mounted camera facing the side yard where anyone approaching would be visible. I placed small, legal notice signs near the most vulnerable entry points stating the property was monitored by video recording. I didn't do anything dramatic. I didn't post threats. I didn't pick a fight. I simply built an indisputable record. Then came the letter that confirmed everything. It wasn't a request this time. It was a demand. It declared that the HOA had retained private security for community enforcement. It declared that my continued refusal to comply would result in managed intervention. It claimed they would ensure compliance with access and exterior requirements, a carefully worded phrase that sounded like control without saying trespass, security. Enforcement, intervention, words like that have weight when they appear on HOA letterhead. They are meant to intimidate. They are meant to make you imagine men in uniforms, clipboards, and vehicles standing at your property like you're a criminal for living on land you paid for. And they are meant to make you think you'll be isolated if you don't cooperate. I reread the letter 3 times, not because I didn't understand it, but because I wanted to be sure I absorbed what they were trying to do. They weren't just claiming authority, they were preparing to physically demonstrate it. In other words, they were going to stage a show. That night I didn't sleep much, not from fear, but from strategy. I made a folder on my desk labeled by date. I placed my deed, survey, and county record printouts inside. I saved every HOA letter and printed screenshots of the camera footage showing the marker flag incident. I wrote down a timeline of events, each date and action, so that nothing would be forgotten or blurred later when people tried to rewrite it. I emailed myself copies. I uploaded backups. I made sure my camera system stored footage both locally and to a secure cloud account. Because I knew what was coming. When people feel entitled to something they don't own, they don't stop at asking. They escalate. They gather allies. They claim moral superiority. They turn paperwork into performance. And the HOA board, with its hunger for control and its taste for public humiliation, was about to cross from letters into something much uglier. The next morning, just after sunrise, I saw the first vehicle roll into the street and stop near the edge of my property. It wasn't a neighbor. It wasn't a delivery truck. It was a dark SUV with no markings, followed by another, then a third. They parked in a staggered line, blocking the view down the street like they were setting up a perimeter. My cameras captured every angle, and as I watched from inside, calm but fully alert, I realized the HOA had chosen their method. They weren't going to win on law, so they were going to try to win on pressure. They were going to surround my home and make me feel trapped on my own land, hoping I'd surrender just to make it stop. They had uniforms and numbers. I had the deed, the law, and cameras, and the siege was just beginning. By mid-morning, the street no longer looked like a place people lived. It looked staged. The SUV hadn't moved, but their presence had altered the atmosphere in a way that was impossible to ignore. They were positioned just far enough apart to feel intentional, just close enough to feel coordinated. Men stepped out of them in dark uniforms that tried very hard to look official without quite committing to any recognizable authority. No police insignia, no city markings. Just security badges clipped to their chests and radios resting on their shoulders, the kind of visual language meant to suggest power without actually having it. They stood near the edge of my property, careful not to cross the line on foot, but close enough that the message was unmistakable. From inside my house, I watched through multiple screens as the performance unfolded. One guard paced slowly along the sidewalk. Another leaned against the hood of an SUV, arms crossed, scanning the house as if waiting for something dramatic to happen. A third spoke into his radio, nodding occasionally, like he was receiving instructions from someone who believed they were in control. There was no shouting, no confrontation yet, just the quiet pressure of presence. The kind of pressure that relies on discomfort rather than force. The kind that works on people who doubt themselves. I didn't step outside. That was part of the strategy on their end. They wanted me visible. They wanted a reaction they could point to later, something they could describe as aggressive or uncooperative. Silence denied them that. Cameras don't react emotionally. They just record, and the guards, whether they realized it or not, were performing for my lenses. Within an hour, the neighborhood noticed. Curtains shifted. Garage doors paused halfway open, then closed again. Phones came out. People stood on porches pretending to check the weather while clearly watching the scene unfold. In communities like this, drama is a currency, and nothing spreads faster than the idea that someone is being handled by authority. The HOA counted on that. They wanted neighbors whispering. They wanted rumors. They wanted me isolated socially so that compliance would feel like relief rather than surrender. The next move came quietly through paperwork. A man in a pressed shirt arrived, not in uniform, carrying a clipboard and a manila envelope. He didn't approach the door. He stood just inside the sidewalk line and placed the envelope on a small stand near my mailbox, then took a photo with his phone, documenting the delivery like it was evidence. My doorbell camera captured the entire thing, his face, his posture, the way he glanced at the cameras before stepping back. Inside the envelope was another notice. This one claimed the HOA had initiated managed access monitoring to ensure compliance with community standards. It asserted that the presence of guards was lawful and temporary, and that continued resistance would result in further measures. It was written in the same carefully vague language as the last letter, never outright stating they had legal authority, but implying it strongly enough that an uninformed reader might believe it. There was no citation of statutes, no reference to actual law, just confidence and formatting. That was when something clicked into place. This wasn't just intimidation. It was theater, and like all theater, it depended on the audience believing the script. I forwarded the notice to my attorney, not because I needed permission to act, but because documentation matters. I also forwarded it to myself, saved it to the same dated folder, and added a note to my timeline. HOA initiates private security presence without legal authority. Every word they used, every step they took, was being recorded not just visually, but contextually. Outside, the guards shifted positions throughout the day, rotating like they were on a schedule. One would leave, another would arrive, always keeping at least 2 vehicles visible. They never crossed onto my land, but they hovered so close to the boundary that it felt intentional, like someone standing inches from your face without touching you, daring you to flinch. At one point, a guard gestured toward my fence while speaking to another, tracing an imaginary line in the air that didn't match the actual boundary. The camera caught that too. By afternoon, the HOA escalated the pressure in a more subtle way. Notices appeared on community boards and neighborhood apps, framing the situation as a compliance issue, involving a homeowner who was refusing to work with the association. And no names were mentioned, but everyone knew who it was about. Words like uncooperative, hostile, and disruptive floated through the posts like fog. The board didn't need to convince everyone. They only needed to convince enough people to justify their actions later. What they didn't realize was how transparent their strategy looked from the outside. Private security hired by a homeowners association does not magically gain jurisdiction over private property. Guards don't become law enforcement because a board votes on it. Authority doesn't exist because someone prints it on letterhead, and intimidation doesn't become legal just because it's quiet. Late in the day, one of the guards finally broke the unspoken rule and stepped closer than before. Not onto my land, but close enough that he was clearly testing how far he could go without crossing a line. He looked directly into one of the cameras for a long moment, then turned away, speaking into his radio again. It was a small thing, but revealing. He knew he was being recorded. They all did, and that knowledge was already changing their behavior. I stayed inside, not hiding, but refusing to participate in their script. I cooked dinner. I worked on my laptop. I let the cameras do their job. Every normal action I took inside my own home became a quiet rejection of their attempt to destabilize me. That was the part they didn't account for. Intimidation only works when the target feels alone and uncertain. I felt neither. As evening settled in, the sub's headlights came on, bathing the front of my house in artificial light. It wasn't aggressive enough to be illegal, but it was invasive enough to be uncomfortable. Another tactic, another test. I adjusted my blinds and made sure the cameras compensated for the change in lighting. The footage remained clear. Somewhere, a board member was likely congratulating themselves, believing the siege would break me in a day or two. They believed the sight of guards and official looking notices would be enough to force compliance. They believed I would step outside, argue, get emotional, make a mistake they could exploit. They didn't understand that the longer they stayed, the worse it got for them. Every hour added to the record. Every guard rotation strengthened the case. Every notice, every vehicle, every gesture became part of a story they didn't control anymore. By nightfall, the street was quiet again, but the vehicles remained. The guards stood in pairs now, talking less, watching more. And inside my house, with documents neatly organized and cameras humming steadily, I felt something settle that wasn't fear or anger. It was clarity. They had chosen intimidation over law, and that choice was going to follow them into every room where truth mattered. The third day didn't begin with movement. It began with stillness, the kind that feels intentional rather than calm. The vehicles were already there when the sun came up, parked in the same positions as if no one had ever left. The guards stood where they had stood the night before, trading places with practiced efficiency, their shift change happening so smoothly it suggested planning far beyond a casual enforcement effort. This wasn't improvised intimidation anymore. It was a routine, and routines leave patterns, patterns leave evidence, and evidence has a way of unraveling people who believe optics matter more than legality. From the outside, it may have looked like nothing was happening. No shouting, no flashing lights, no confrontation. That was the point. The HOA wanted the situation to feel normalized, like the presence of private guards near a homeowner's property was an acceptable, everyday solution to disagreement. They wanted neighbors to get used to it. They wanted discomfort to fade into background noise, but normalization is a gamble because once people adjust, they also start asking why something is there at all. I spent the morning reviewing footage from the previous 2 days, not casually, but deliberately. I noted timestamps. I watched how often guards glanced at the cameras. I observed how their spacing changed depending on who was around. When neighbors were nearby, they stood taller, more visible. When the street was empty, they drifted closer to the boundary line. That behavior wasn't random, it was performative. They were aware of being watched, not just by me, but by the neighborhood. Late in the morning, the HOA made another move, this time aimed at creating urgency. A notice appeared taped to a post near the entrance of my driveway, positioned so it could be photographed easily by anyone passing by. It warned of pending compliance action and referenced an upcoming board meeting where final determinations would be made. The language was vague enough to sound serious without committing to specifics. It was meant to suggest inevitability. What it actually suggested was desperation. They were trying to pull the conflict into their preferred arena, the boardroom. In HOA culture, board meetings are where power is displayed and dissent is controlled. Homeowners are given a few minutes to speak, then talked over, then voted down. Records are selectively summarized. Decisions are framed as unanimous even when they aren't. The HOA wanted me to walk into that room already weakened, already painted as the problem, already surrounded by the visual proof of their enforcement. They didn't understand that I had no intention of walking in blind. Throughout the day, I received messages from neighbors I barely knew. Some were cautious, asking if everything was okay. Others were thinly veiled warnings, suggesting it might be easier to just work with the HOA, to make the situation go away. A few were openly judgmental, repeating phrases straight from the board's notices about community standards and cooperation. None of them asked about the deed. None of them asked about the law. They were responding to the story they'd been fed, not the reality underneath it. That was when I realized the siege wasn't just physical. It was narrative. The HOA wasn't trying to remove me from my land by force. They were trying to rewrite my position in the social hierarchy of the neighborhood. They wanted me seen as an outsider, a disruptor, someone whose resistance justified extreme measures. If they could accomplish that, the guards wouldn't need to stay forever. Peer pressure would finish the job. I countered quietly. I didn't post emotional responses. I didn't accuse. I didn't rant. Instead, I shared a single, carefully worded message in a neighborhood forum where the notices had been circulating. It stated that my property was not subject to HOA authority, that the boundaries were recorded with the county, and that private security had no jurisdiction over my land. I didn't include opinions. I included facts. I mentioned documentation existed. I ended by stating that all activity around my property was being recorded for legal purposes. The reaction was immediate and revealing. Some neighbors went silent. Others doubled down, insisting the HOA wouldn't act without cause. A few asked for clarification about boundaries, something they'd never questioned before. The board's supporters responded with generic reassurances and deflections, repeating that the matter was under review. No one from the HOA directly contradicted what I said. They couldn't. Outside, the guards noticed the shift before I did. Their posture changed. Conversations grew shorter. One of them made a phone call and paced near his vehicle longer than usual, glancing repeatedly toward my house as if expecting me to appear. Another adjusted the placement of cones near the curb, subtly encroaching closer than before, then moved them back after realizing a camera had a clear view. That afternoon, a different kind of visitor arrived. A survey crew truck slowed near my property, hesitated, then parked a short distance away. Two men stepped out, looking around with visible uncertainty. They didn't approach the house. They spoke briefly with one of the guards, who gestured toward my fence line, then shook his head. The surveyors returned to their truck and left without setting foot on the property. That moment mattered more than the HOA realized. Surveyors don't leave when they believe they have authorization. They leave when something doesn't add up. When paperwork doesn't match claims, when access isn't lawful, the cameras captured their hesitation, their conversation, their departure. Another piece of the puzzle locked into place. As evening approached, the HOA tried one more pressure tactic: escalation by implication. An email went out to residents stating that legal options were being explored to resolve an ongoing compliance issue, and that patience was appreciated while the board worked to protect community interests. It was vague, but the intent was clear. They wanted people to believe a lawsuit was coming, and that I was the cause of potential costs or assessments. Fear is a powerful motivator in HOA communities. No one wants higher dues. No one wants legal drama, By framing me as the obstacle to resolution, they hoped the neighborhood would turn fully against me, but fear cuts both ways. Late that night, I reviewed my documentation again, adding notes, organizing files, and labeling video clips. I didn't feel rushed. I felt methodical, because intimidation relies on momentum, and momentum collapses when it meets preparation. The HOA had chosen to escalate without authority, and every step they took made retreat harder. The guards stayed through the night, rotating again just before midnight. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, and the vehicles sat like monuments to a bad decision. Inside, my house was quiet, steady, unchanged. The pattern was clear now. They would keep pushing until something broke. The only question left was whether it would be me, or the illusion of authority they were clinging to. By the fourth day, the presence of the guards no longer felt like a temporary measure. It felt institutional, as if the HOA was daring anyone with authority to challenge them. The vehicles rotated, but the pattern stayed the same. The uniforms stayed the same. The quiet pressure stayed constant. It was no longer about sending a message to me alone. It was about demonstrating to the entire neighborhood that the board could extend its reach beyond paperwork and into physical space. That belief was dangerous, not just for me, but for anyone who thought property rights were more than suggestions. The morning began with movement that looked small but carried weight. One of the guards repositioned his vehicle so that it partially blocked the natural exit from my driveway. Not enough to trap me in, not enough to clearly violate any statute, but enough to force a decision if I chose to leave. It was a subtle test, a way to see whether I would assert myself or accept inconvenience as the new normal. I didn't take the bait. I noted the time, marked the footage, and watched as the vehicle was moved back into its original position less than 20 minutes later. They were experimenting, measuring how far pressure could be applied without triggering consequences. That was when I realized the siege had entered its most unstable phase. Escalation without authority relies on restraint. The moment intimidation becomes obstruction, the moment presence becomes interference, the entire structure collapses under its own illegality. The HOA was walking a narrow line, and the people they hired were being asked to do the same. Private security works best when it operates in clearly defined spaces with explicit permission. Here, they had neither. Midday brought a new tactic, one that revealed just how confident the board had become in its own narrative. Temporary signage appeared along the street near my property, identical in style to HOA parking notices, warning of restricted access, and authorized personnel only. The signs didn't mention my address, they didn't cite a reason, they didn't reference any law, but they were positioned in a way that suggested my home was the source of the restriction. It was psychological fencing, meant to create the impression of exclusion without erecting a physical barrier. The cameras captured neighbors slowing their cars to read the signs. Some turned around. Others parked farther away and walked instead of driving past. The street itself began to feel segmented, like an invisible border had been drawn around my house. That isolation was intentional. If people avoided the area, there would be fewer witnesses, fewer questions, fewer voices challenging the board's authority. Inside, I added the signage to my growing record. I took screenshots. I saved still frames from multiple angles. I compared them to the HOA governing documents, which I had already reviewed thoroughly. There was no provision allowing the board to restrict access to a public street. There was no clause authorizing private security to control movement near a non-member's property. The signs were pure theater, unsupported by anything but confidence. Confidence, however, is contagious when left unchallenged. That afternoon, an HOA board member finally appeared in person, not to speak with me, but to observe. He stood with the guards, gesturing toward the house, pointing at the fence line, nodding as if confirming assumptions rather than facts. He didn't knock. He didn't attempt communication. His presence was meant to legitimize the spectacle, to visually tie the board to the enforcement action. It was a mistake. The cameras caught his face clearly. His gestures clearly, the way he lingered just long enough to be seen, then left as if his job was done. He wanted to be associated with authority without being associated with accountability. As the day wore on, the atmosphere shifted again, this time in a way that felt less controlled. One of the guards became visibly agitated, pacing more frequently, checking his phone, speaking into his radio with sharper movements. Another stood apart from the group, posture tense, scanning the area repeatedly as if expecting confrontation. The confidence of the first days was thinning, replaced by uncertainty. They had been told they were enforcing rules. Now they were realizing they might be standing on the wrong side of something that could follow them personally. Late in the afternoon, the HOA attempted a more direct pressure point. A certified letter was delivered, requiring a signature. I didn't answer the door. The carrier left a notice. The letter would have to wait. I knew what it would contain before I ever opened it. A final warning, a deadline, perhaps a threat of legal action, framed as inevitable. What mattered wasn't the content. What mattered was timing. They wanted to force a response while the guards were still present, to create the impression that compliance came as a result of enforcement rather than truth. They didn't get that satisfaction. As evening approached, something unexpected happened. A city vehicle drove slowly past the street, paused near the signage, and continued on. It didn't stop. No one got out, but its presence changed the energy immediately. The guards straightened. One of them adjusted his radio and spoke quietly. The signage was removed less than an hour later, taken down as casually as it had been placed. Someone, somewhere, had started paying attention. That was the moment I understood the HOA's biggest miscalculation. They believed that by keeping everything just shy of overt illegality, they would avoid scrutiny. They forgot that patterns attract attention even when individual actions seem minor. A cluster of private security vehicles, unofficial signage, board members observing from the sidelines, a non-HOA property being treated like a problem to be managed. All of it together told a story that didn't align with the one they were telling residents. Night fell again, and the guards remained, but something fundamental had shifted. They spoke less. They stood farther from the boundary. The sub's headlights were angled away from the house instead of directly toward it. The siege was still there, but it had lost its certainty. Inside, I organized one final set of files and labeled a new folder, Crossed Lines. It contained the vehicle repositioning footage, the signage images, the board members' visit, and the survey crew interaction from the previous day. It wasn't dramatic evidence. It was something far more dangerous to the HOA, consistent proof of overreach. The board thought pressure would make me fold. What it was actually doing was building a case so clean, so detailed, and so undeniable that when the moment came, there would be nowhere for them to hide, and that moment was closer than they realized. By the fifth day, the siege had developed a rhythm, and rhythms invite scrutiny. What began as an attempt to overwhelm me with presence had hardened into something repetitive, predictable, and increasingly hollow. The guards were still there, the vehicles still positioned with deliberate intent, but the energy had changed. It no longer felt like a show of strength. It felt like maintenance of a lie that was becoming harder to justify with each passing hour. The HOA had committed to an image of control, and now they were trapped by it, forced to keep paying for uniforms, fuel, and manpower simply to avoid admitting they had no authority to be there in the first place. That morning, I finally opened the certified letter. I did it slowly, methodically, like everything else. As expected, it was framed as a final notice. It referenced previous correspondence, accused me of obstructing reasonable enforcement, and set a deadline for compliance that had no legal foundation. It threatened legal action without specifying jurisdiction, statute, or standing. The letter was long on confidence and short on substance. What stood out most was what it didn't include: any acknowledgement of my deed, my documentation, or the county records I had already provided. It was as if the board believed ignoring reality would eventually make it irrelevant. I scanned the letter, saved it, and added it to the growing archive. Then I did something the HOA clearly didn't expect. I requested records. In many jurisdictions, homeowners associations are required to maintain transparency for actions taken on behalf of the community. Contracts, board votes, expenditures, notices, even when dealing with non-members, their internal processes still matter. I submitted a formal records request asking for the authorization to hire private security, the scope of their assignment, and the documentation supporting their claim of jurisdiction over my property. I kept the request neutral, factual, and impossible to misinterpret. It wasn't a challenge, it was a spotlight. Outside, the guards continued their routine, but now their presence felt disconnected from purpose. They stood because they had been told to stand. They watched because they had been paid to watch. But without escalation, without engagement, without results, their role was reduced to background noise. Neighbors had begun to adjust again, not by accepting the siege, but by questioning it. Cars slowed not out of curiosity, but confusion. People lingered longer at the edge of the street, clearly trying to reconcile what they were seeing with what they had been told. Midday brought the first visible crack in the HOA coordination. One of the guard vehicles failed to show up for a scheduled rotation. The remaining guards adjusted, spreading themselves thinner, repositioning to compensate. It was a small logistical failure, but telling. Either the security company was having staffing issues, or the HOA was struggling to keep funding the operation. Neither explanation worked in their favor. That afternoon, I received a response to my records request. It wasn't what I'd asked for, it was a deflection. The HOA claimed the documents were under review, and that my request would be addressed at the upcoming board meeting. That response alone spoke volumes. If the authorization existed, it would have been easy to produce. If the vote had been properly recorded, it would have been easy to cite. Their inability to respond directly suggested what I already knew. The siege was built on assumption, not approval. The cameras caught another revealing moment shortly after. A guard approached one of the vehicles and spoke animatedly to the driver, gesturing toward the house, then toward the street, then finally shaking his head. The driver responded with a shrug that felt less like indifference and more like resignation. These were not men confident in their mission. They were men realizing they had been placed in a situation where responsibility might eventually find them personally. As the sun dipped lower, a new tactic emerged, one that confirmed the HOA growing discomfort. A board announcement was circulated claiming the guards were present for general community safety and not related to any specific homeowner. It was a transparent attempt to rewrite history. The same guards who had arrived immediately after compliance demands were now being reframed as a coincidence. The same signage that had suggested restricted access was now conveniently forgotten. That kind of narrative shift doesn't signal strength. It signals retreat without admission. I documented the announcement, saved screenshots, and compared it to earlier notices that explicitly tied enforcement to my alleged noncompliance. Contradiction was stark. Two versions of the same story, both issued by the same authority, each incompatible with the other. In legal terms, that's not confusion, that's inconsistency, and inconsistency is fatal when credibility matters. That evening, something else happened that the HOA couldn't control. A local social media group picked up the story. Someone posted a photo of the guard vehicles with a caption asking why a private security force was stationed outside a single home. Comments followed quickly. Some defended the HOA reflexively. Others asked uncomfortable questions about jurisdiction and property rights. A few people, more informed than the board anticipated, pointed out that HOA cannot extend authority beyond recorded boundaries. The discussion didn't need my participation. The facts were finally moving without me pushing them. Inside, I reviewed my files again, this time with a different lens. I wasn't just collecting evidence anymore. I was watching the collapse of a structure built entirely on perceived power. The HOA had assumed that no one would question them. That assumption was unraveling in real time. As night settled in, the number of guards was reduced again. 2 vehicles instead of 3, less movement, less confidence. The siege hadn't ended, but it had shrunk, like something exposed to air for too long. I labeled another folder, this one titled Contradictions, and placed the announcement, the deflected records request, and the staffing gaps inside. The HOA had surrounded my house with guards, believing presence would replace proof. What they hadn't prepared for was the paper wall behind their performance, the absence of authorization, the missing votes, the non-existent jurisdiction. Pressure can intimidate people, but it cannot create legality where none exists. The board was running out of options, and the longer they delayed admitting it, the more public their collapse was going to be. The sixth day began with something the HOA hadn't anticipated: anticipation from everyone else. The guards were still there, but they no longer commanded attention. They blended into the background like a set piece left on stage after the audience had started questioning the plot. What drew focus now wasn't the vehicles or the uniforms, but the upcoming board meeting. The HOA had positioned it as the place where everything would be resolved, where authority would be reaffirmed, and the situation would be put to rest. They believed that if they could dominate that room, they could reclaim the narrative they were losing outside of it. I had no intention of letting that happen. In the days leading up to the meeting, I organized my materials not as a homeowner reacting emotionally, but as someone presenting a record. I didn't prepare speeches. I prepared timelines. I didn't plan arguments. I planned references. Every document was labeled. Every video clip had a timestamp. Every letter was placed in chronological order. The goal wasn't to overwhelm. It was to make the truth impossible to avoid. Outside, the guards thinned again. Only one vehicle remained parked near my property that morning, its presence more symbolic than functional. It sat there for hours without movement, like an admission that the siege had failed, but no one wanted to be the first to say it. Neighbors walked past without slowing. The tension that once surrounded the house had dissipated, replaced by a quiet curiosity about what would happen next. The board meeting was scheduled for that evening, and the HOA made sure everyone knew it. Notices went out emphasizing attendance, framing the agenda as a matter of community importance. They wanted a crowd. Crowds can be steered, applauded, and reassured. Crowds can be used to validate authority. What they didn't consider was that crowds also witness. When the time came, the meeting room filled quickly. Board members sat at the front, expressions carefully composed, projecting confidence that no longer matched reality. The guards were not present inside, a deliberate choice. Their absence was meant to signal normalcy, as if the previous days had been nothing more than routine operations. The board began with standard formalities, hoping to establish control through procedure. When my turn came, I didn't raise my voice, I didn't accuse, I didn't dramatize, I presented. I laid out the deed first, explaining its legal description and the recorded boundaries. I followed with the county survey, showing the clear separation between my property and the HOA jurisdiction. I referenced the dates of the HOA letters, the shift in language from friendly request to enforcement threat, and the absence of any legal citation supporting their claims. I then introduced the security presence, not as a complaint, but as a documented sequence of events: vehicles, uniforms, signage, board member observation, survey crew interaction. The room changed as the pattern became visible. I didn't need to accuse the HOA of intimidation. The timeline did that on its own. I didn't need to question their authority. The lack of authorization spoke louder than any challenge. When I referenced my formal records request and the board's inability to produce documentation, the silence that followed was heavier than any argument. I concluded by stating a simple fact: private security had no jurisdiction over my property, the HOA had no authority over my land, and the continued presence of guards constituted an attempt to exert control where none existed. I reminded them that all activity had been recorded and preserved. There was no threat in my tone, just finality. The board responded the way boards often do when cornered, by deflecting. They spoke of misunderstandings, of good intentions, of efforts to maintain harmony. They claimed the security presence was coincidental, a general safety measure, a response to unrelated concerns. But their words collided with their own earlier notices, which clearly tied enforcement to my alleged noncompliance. Someone in the audience asked a question about the boundaries. Another asked why private security was needed at all. A third asked whether the board had voted on the measures. Each question peeled back another layer of the illusion. The board members began to contradict one another, one claiming approval existed, another suggesting it was informal, a third insisting legal counsel had been consulted without providing evidence. The meeting slipped from control into exposure. By the end, The board announced they would pause enforcement activities, pending further review. It was a retreat wrapped in administrative language, but a retreat nonetheless. The siege, as they had framed it, was over. Outside, when the meeting ended, the last guard vehicle was already gone. The street was empty again, just houses and pavement and the quiet normalcy that should have been there all along. Inside my house, I added one final folder to the archive, Public Record. It contained notes from the meeting, statements made by board members, and the questions asked by residents. The story was no longer mine alone. It belonged to everyone who had witnessed the collapse of authority built on assumption. The HOA had tried to surround my house with guards. What they hadn't realized was that the moment they stepped into the light of documentation and public scrutiny, they were the ones surrounded. The morning after the board meeting felt different in a way that was hard to describe but impossible to miss. The street looked the same, the houses unchanged, the sidewalks still lined with trimmed hedges and identical lamps, yet the air carried a sense of aftermath. The siege was gone, but its absence was louder than its presence had ever been. Where the guard vehicles once sat like punctuation marks of intimidation, there was now only empty pavement and the quiet acknowledgement that something had ended badly for the people who started it. The HOA moved quickly, not to fix what they had done, but to manage the damage. Within hours, a carefully worded email went out to residents thanking them for their patience and announcing that the matter discussed at the meeting had been resolved internally. The language was deliberate. It avoided admissions. It avoided details. It avoided naming me, the guards, or the weeks of pressure that had unfolded in full view of the neighborhood. It framed the outcome as routine governance rather than a forced retreat. But control over messaging only works when everyone hears the message at the same time. That window had already closed. Neighbors who had attended the meeting talked, not in official forums, but in driveways, over fences, and in group chats the board didn't moderate. They compared what they'd seen to what they'd been told. They noticed the contradictions. They replayed moments where board members had stumbled over simple questions. The idea that the HOA had overstepped its authority wasn't speculative anymore. It was shared understanding. That was when the second scramble began, the one that mattered more than the guards ever did. The board started reaching out privately. Emails arrived from individual members, no longer speaking with the unified confidence of official notices. Their tone was cautious, almost conciliatory. They asked for understanding. They suggested miscommunication. They floated the idea of moving forward without conflict. None of them acknowledged the siege directly. None of them addressed the legality of what had happened. They wanted closure without accountability. I didn't respond immediately. Silence at that stage was not avoidance. It was leverage. Outside, small signs of retreat appeared. A notice that had once implied enforcement was quietly removed from a community board. A thread on the neighborhood app was locked to prevent misinformation. A board member deleted an earlier comment that had confidently defended the security presence. Each action was minor on its own, but together they revealed a pattern of erasure. The HOA was trying to rewrite the past in real time, hoping that if enough traces disappeared, the story would soften into ambiguity. Inside my house, nothing changed. The cameras stayed active. The files stayed organized. The archive didn't shrink just because the pressure had eased. That was the mistake organizations like this often make. They believe that once the immediate conflict is over, the record no longer matters. In reality, the record matters most after the noise stops, when consequences are decided quietly and reputations are reshaped behind closed doors. By midweek, a new announcement appeared, this one framed as a policy update. It clarified the limits of HOA authority regarding non-member properties and emphasized respect for recorded boundaries. It was written as if the clarification had always been obvious, as if no recent events had forced its creation. The board presented it as proactive governance rather than corrective action. People noticed anyway. Some residents expressed relief. Others expressed frustration that it had taken a public confrontation to produce something so basic. A few began asking broader questions about how many other assumptions the HOA operated on without verification. Authority, once cracked, invites inspection. That was when the final piece of the scramble emerged. The HOA legal counsel became visible, not through formal action, but through presence. A name appeared on correspondence where there had been none before. Language grew more careful. Phrases that once implied power were replaced with neutral terms. The board had shifted from enforcement mode to damage control mode, and that shift carried an unspoken admission. They knew they had crossed a line. I finally responded, briefly and precisely. I acknowledged receipt of their messages. I reiterated the documented boundaries. I stated that any future actions involving my property would require proper legal authority. There was no emotion in the response, no invitation to debate. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a boundary reaffirmed. The HOA didn't reply. Days passed without incident. No vehicles returned. No notices appeared. The street settled back into its routine, but the memory of what had happened lingered beneath the surface. People waved again, but now there was curiosity behind it. Not hostility. Curiosity. The kind that follows a power structure when it stumbles publicly. What the HOA hadn't anticipated was that even in retreat, they were still revealing themselves. The rush to control the narrative, the quiet deletions, the sudden policy clarifications, all confirmed what the siege had already shown. Their authority depended more on assumption than law. And assumptions don't survive exposure. The guards were gone, but the consequences were only beginning. Because when an HOA loses control publicly, it doesn't just lose a single dispute. It loses the unquestioned obedience that made overreach possible in the first place. Time has a way of revealing whether something is truly over or merely waiting for its consequences to surface. In the days following the HOA retreat, life appeared to return to normal on the surface. Lawns were cut, trash bins rolled out and back in on schedule. The board resumed posting reminders about paint colors and parking rules as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But beneath that routine, the record remained quiet and intact, like a fault line running under freshly poured concrete. The HOA wanted the incident forgotten. The problem was that it had been documented too thoroughly to fade into rumor. The first sign that the record still mattered came from outside the neighborhood. A local journalist reached out, asking general questions about HOA authority and property disputes. They didn't mention my address. They didn't mention the guards, but the timing was too precise to be coincidence. Someone had talked. Someone had shared photos or clips or meeting notes. The story was no longer confined to internal channels, and that alone was enough to unsettle a board that thrived on controlled environments. The HOA responded the only way it knew how, by saying nothing publicly while tightening its internal posture. Meetings that were once casually scheduled became more formal. Agendas grew longer and more detailed. Minutes were suddenly precise, careful to avoid ambiguity. The board had learned a painful lesson about what happens when assumptions are made in the open. They were trying to rebuild authority not by expanding it, but by narrowing their exposure. Inside my house, the archive stayed untouched, but never inactive. I reviewed it occasionally, not out of obsession, but out of principle. Records exist to preserve truth, not to be admired, and this truth had layers. It wasn't just about guards or signage or letters. It was about how easily a private organization could convince itself that pressure equaled power, and how quickly that belief collapsed when confronted with documentation. Neighbors continued to ask questions, though now they did so quietly. Some wanted reassurance that the HOA couldn't do the same thing to them. Others wanted to know how to protect themselves if it tried. A few admitted they had assumed the board's authority extended further than it actually did, simply because no one had challenged it before. The siege had failed, but it had also educated. That education unsettled the board more than any formal complaint ever could. One evening, a revised set of community guidelines was circulated, emphasizing respect for property rights, transparency in enforcement actions, and the importance of legal review before escalation. It read like a corporate apology without the word apology anywhere in it. The board framed it as an improvement, a sign of growth. Residents read it as a response to fear. The irony was unavoidable. The HOA had tried to force compliance through intimidation, and in doing so had created the very scrutiny it feared. Their actions had pulled back the curtain on how fragile their authority really was when stripped of compliance and habit. The guards had been the most visible part of the overreach, but they were only a symptom. The real issue was a culture that believed control was something you could assert rather than earn. As weeks passed, the story solidified into something the board could not erase, a shared memory. It didn't need to be retold in detail. It existed as a cautionary reference, invoked whenever a new rule felt arbitrary or a notice felt too confident. People remembered the week the HOA surrounded a house and lost. They remembered the meeting where answers fell apart. They remembered how quickly power retreated when asked to justify itself. I never needed to push that memory forward. It lived on its own. From my perspective, the outcome was simple. My property remained mine. The boundaries remained unchanged. The law remained exactly what it had always been. What had shifted was the balance of belief. The HOA no longer operated in a vacuum of unquestioned authority. They knew now that records mattered, that cameras mattered, that calm persistence mattered more than compliance born of fear. The siege was over, but its echo had reshaped the neighborhood. And for an organization built on the quiet assumption that no one would ever say no, that echo was louder than any guard vehicle had ever been. The HOA believed the worst was behind them once the guards disappeared and the headlines failed to materialize. From their perspective, survival meant silence. If the story didn't explode publicly, they assumed it would quietly decay into neighborhood lore, softened by time and routine. What they never planned for was the way consequences travel slowly, settling into systems rather than headlines. The true cost of their actions didn't arrive all at once. It arrived in hesitation, in paperwork, in the subtle erosion of confidence that no policy revision could restore. It began with resistance that no longer announced itself. Homeowners started asking for citations when notices appeared. They requested documentation for fines that had once been paid without question. They asked whether votes had been properly recorded, whether enforcement actions had been reviewed by council, whether the board's authority actually extended to the issue being addressed. None of it was loud. None of it was hostile. It was procedural, persistent, and deeply inconvenient for a board accustomed to obedience. The HOA responded by tightening language even further, but caution slowed everything down. What once took days now took weeks. Decisions were deferred, enforcement action stalled. The board members, once so comfortable asserting power, began hedging every statement. Authority, when questioned consistently, loses its efficiency. And efficiency was the HOA real power. Behind closed doors, something else was happening. Board turnover accelerated. One member resigned citing personal reasons. Another stopped attending meetings regularly. New volunteers were harder to recruit. The position had lost its illusion of control and gained a reputation for risk. No one wanted to be the next person whose name appeared in a record attached to overreach. The security company that had participated in the siege quietly severed its relationship with the HOA. There was no announcement, no explanation. Their vehicles simply never returned, even for unrelated community events. Private security firms survive on reputation. An association with questionable authority is bad for business. Someone had reviewed the footage. Someone had asked questions. Someone had decided the liability wasn't worth the contract. That decision mattered more than the HOA realized. It meant the board's most aggressive tool had been taken off the table without a fight. The illusion that they could summon enforcement at will was gone, replaced by the reality that vendors also assess risk. Authority doesn't exist in isolation. It depends on others believing in it enough to act on its behalf. The final consequence arrived quietly in the form of an audit. Not a dramatic one, not a public one, but a routine review triggered by internal complaints and procedural inconsistencies. The HOA framed it as a standard financial check, but odd. It's don't ask questions unless something invites them. Expenditures related to the security presence required justification. Contracts required authorization. Minutes required verification. Each answer led to another question, and each question reopened the wound the board had tried so hard to seal. I watched all of this from a distance, uninvolved but aware. The archive remained closed, but its existence shaped every outcome. The board knew it was there. They knew what it contained. They knew that if they escalated again, the record would expand, not disappear. That knowledge restrained them more effectively than any threat ever could. The neighborhood adjusted, life moved on, but the balance had shifted permanently. The HOA no longer operated on assumption alone. It operated under observation, whether real or imagined. Cameras didn't need to be everywhere. Documentation didn't need to be shared. The idea that someone could and would record overreach was enough. In trying to force compliance through intimidation, the HOA had taught the community something they could never unteach. Authority must justify itself. And once that lesson takes root, it spreads quietly, undermining every structure built on unquestioned power. By the time the year turned, the incident had stopped being referred to directly. No one mentioned guards anymore. No one referenced the week the street was lined with vehicles, or the meeting where authority unraveled in public. Instead, the change lived in behavior. It lived in the way notices were written more carefully, in the way board members hesitated before sending enforcement letters, in the way residents no longer assumed that confidence equaled correctness. The HOA still existed, the rules still existed, but the unspoken power behind them had thinned, replaced by something far less reliable: accountability. The board eventually restructured itself, quietly rotating leadership and rebranding its approach as more collaborative. New faces appeared at meetings, using softer language and emphasizing community input. It was an attempt to rebuild trust without reopening old wounds. The effort wasn't insincere, but it was cautious, restrained by the memory of what had happened when restraint was absent. Every decision now carried the weight of precedent. My house returned fully to being just a house. No attention, no tension, no watchers. The cameras remained, not as symbols of conflict, but as tools of normal life. The archive stayed intact, untouched, because it no longer needed to grow. Its purpose had been fulfilled the moment escalation stopped. Records don't exist to be used forever. They exist to ensure something doesn't happen again. Occasionally, someone new to the neighborhood would ask about the boundaries, about how the HOA worked, about what authority really meant. The answers were simpler now, grounded in fact rather than assumption. People knew where lines were drawn. They knew that ownership wasn't flexible just because a board wished it to be. That knowledge spread quietly, passed from one conversation to the next, forming a collective awareness that didn't require confrontation to sustain itself. The HOA never apologized publicly. They didn't need to. Apologies acknowledge mistakes. Behavior changes acknowledge consequences, and consequences had reshaped them more effectively than any statement ever could. What remained when the power was gone was clarity. The law hadn't changed. The deed hadn't changed. The difference was that everyone had seen what happened when intimidation tried to replace legitimacy. They had seen how quickly authority collapsed when asked to prove itself. They had seen that calm persistence, documentation, and patience were stronger than any show of force a private organization could muster. The HOA had surrounded my house with guards, believing pressure would end resistance. Instead, they surrounded themselves with a record they could never fully escape. And in the end, the quiet return to normal wasn't their victory. It was proof that the only thing they had ever truly needed to respect was what had been there all along: the deed, the law, and the simple fact that power without permission cannot last.